Hey friends, today I'm going to share a book with you. It's a historical fiction, so that means the story itself is not true, but it's about a true event in history. It's about an event called the Great Migration, and the story is called Overground Railroad. Now remember, during slavery time they had the Underground Railroad where they were hiding slaves to get them to freedom. This is called the Overground Railroad. Author is Lesa Cline-Ransome, illustrator James Ransome. So the Great Migration happened between 1916 and 1970. Before 1916, about 90% of the African Americans in our whole entire country lived in the South, and they were living in rural areas like farms and plantations, just like they had done when they were slaves. But there was a lot of racial injustice, a lot of segregation. It was hard for them to find jobs. So starting in 1916, people started heading north. And they mostly moved to cities like Chicago and New York, and they worked in a lot of the industrial places like factories and things like that. And they moved because they wanted a better life for themselves and their family. So by 1970, about 80% of African Americans were living all over the country, and a lot of them were in cities. So this story is about that move. So Overground Railroad. So here's where they started. And a lot of them worked on cotton plantations. That's what cotton looks like when it grows. Some walked, some drove, but we took the train north. Me and Mama and Daddy got to the station crack of dawn early before anyone could see us leave. Daddy holding tight to me with one hand, 3 tickets to New York in the other. Just think how brave you have to be to get up and leave your life as you know it to go somewhere you've never been before and start over. The porter helped us on board, then handed us our bags and our shoebox filled with food and tied with a string. On to the first train out of North Carolina, just as the conductor yelled, "All aboard the New York-bound Silver Meteor!" Daddy led me to the last seats in the colored car and let me sit next to the window to watch as the train whistled and chugged, leaving puffs of smoke behind. The next conductor shouts, "Next stop, Rocky Mount." We left in secret before Daddy's boss knew. Before our lease was up, we said our goodbyes to Uncle Buck and Granddaddy and Grandma, her wet cheek pressed against mine. "Ruth Ellen, you mind your Mama and Daddy," she said. So a lot of these people, what would happen is they would lease land from the farmer who owned the land, and they had to actually pay to live there. And by the time they worked the crop and paid for everything they owed the farmer, they didn't really have much money. It really wasn't much better than slavery, quite frankly. So she's saying they left in the middle of the night because they still had a lease and they weren't finished with it. And so they didn't want the boss to know. "No more picking," Daddy had said. "No more working someone else's land," Mama said proud. "We're going to make our way up north," they both said. Out the window I watched the Blue Ridge Mountains and fields with folks already hunched and picking row after row of cotton, tobacco, and peanuts every day, except the Lord's Day, just like my granddaddy, but not anymore for my daddy. So I'm not sure why her grandparents didn't come, because that's the life they live. Look at them all out there working. It's really hard work, and they make really almost no money. At the next stop, more people in boxes and satchels squeezed onto the colored car, so many they stood on tired feet or sat on hard floors, wherever they were. They're leaving in search of hope and a better life. Some will find it and some won't. Daddy pulled out cards to pass the time. I won at rummy, Daddy at war. In my bag is the book Teacher pressed into my hands on the last day of school before we left. Next stop, Norfolk, Virginia. In our straight back seats, when we finish with cards, Mama fusses in her purse, Daddy stares ahead. I take out the book Teacher gave me. The cover's worn, pages 2. "Read to me, Ruthie," Mama says, and I do. First the title, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And I imagine you know who Frederick Douglass is, but he was a very famous African American. And this is what he looks like. Then I turned to the first page. I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsboro, and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. Mama listens till her eyes blink longer than close, but I keep on. Next stop, Alexandria, Virginia. Out the window, in between pages, I watch as crooked shacks sprout on the edges of fields. Folks wave from their doorways, and I wave back. Mama turns in her sleep, restless and dreaming. All around me, everybody leaving for the north. Talks in Bible words, Exodus, Egypt, Canaan, hoping that Chicago, Detroit, and New York City are the promised land. Next stop, Washington, D.C. The porters come and move signs, waking Daddy, telling everyone in the colored section to sit where they want. We don't have to stay in front behind the engine breathing in smoke because we're past the line that divides black from white, south from north, wrong from right. I wait to move, but we wait more. Finally, Daddy takes my hand and Mama stands and we walk down the aisle, out of the colored car and through the curtain. Next stop, Baltimore, Maryland. So they crossed the area where you didn't have segregation anymore, so now they could sit wherever they wanted to. And that's probably the first time that ever happened to them since they've lived their whole lives in the South. On the other side of the curtain in the dining car was tablecloths and clinking glasses and white faces and good food smells that my stomach growls. And it makes me wish we hadn't eaten Grandma's fried chicken and hard-boiled eggs and lemon pound cakes so soon. Next stop, Newark, Delaware. Did you see it's not racially segregated there? We walk past row after row of white folks who stare or turn away with eyes that say, keep moving when they see us. Some put hands in empty seats, not here, and we keep walking until we find smiles from new neighbors. So even though this area wasn't segregated, some people still didn't like people of color. And so look, this woman's putting her hand in the seat so no one will sit next to her. Out the window, people turn and point, and I see water. A whole river running along beside us. It's the Delaware River, a mother says to her boy. The book teacher gave me has pages filled with the story of a boy leaving behind what he knew and heading to what he don't, just like me. Only he didn't have a ticket, bought by his daddy, and food packed by his grandma. She's talking about Frederick Douglass, who also fled the South, and so she's comparing herself to him. So he was cold and hungry, but he kept on running at night with only the North Star to guide him, because he escaped slavery. And along the Delaware River, it's in secret, getting help along the way, till he made his way, walking to freedom north. Next stop, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So he took advantage of the Underground Railroad, and they're on the Overground Railroad. I watch the tracks in front of me and behind me just as far as the eye can see. Mama and Daddy say jobs, education, freedom are waiting in New York for us. And like the boy in the book, we're all running from and running to the same time. Last stop, New York City, Penn Station. You see the look of hope on her face? We step off the train and I stretch my neck to see bright lights, tall buildings shimmering against the sky, bright as 100 North Stars. Daddy grabs our bags and I squeeze Mama's hand. The other holds tight to my book. So this talks a little bit about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who worked on the Underground Railroad. And it talks about why people were leaving, and I already pretty much told you, but if you ever check out the book, you can read it. So after the slaves were emancipated back in the late 1800s, they didn't have a lot of opportunities. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, they had no money, they had no skills, and so they were pretty much stuck right where they were, and if they went somewhere else, it was really hard to find anything to do. So that's why a lot of them ended up staying where they were or working for another farmer who owned the land, and they just rented the land, and they would have to pay for everything, like the tools and the land and the seed and everything. By the time they got done with their harvest, they would hardly have any money left. So that's why people started leaving to the north in hopes of getting a better education and better jobs and a better life for their families. So like I said, this is called historical fiction. This family in the story is not real, but the Great Migration is. I hope you learned something. Happy reading.